any disagreement I have with the consensus, tons of other scholars do as well. So it's not like me, the lone wolf, making these claims. There's lots of scholars that side with my dating of things too. I think they're all written by Paul, and they're all written in the 50s AD. I don't know about the order. You can argue about what order they were written in or exactly when in the 50s. I don't think that's resolvable.
And I'm suspicious that the author of the earliest version of the Gospel of John knew Luke when it was still attached to the Acts of the Apostles. I think Papias himself is a Johannine Christian, and he knows all the sections of the Apocalypse of John that he knows are from the vision section, not the stuff that is attributed to John.
Dr. Richard Carrier, Aaron J. has another question, and I want to phrase this. We'll have you start, then Dr. MacDonald will go ahead and give his assessment on this. Dating is a pretty important topic. When you put something, can define like what maybe is going on and how you date these things also might affect the determination of what it means or how the origins.
Reliable it is. Yeah,
right. So many things come up, and we're not going to get into all the why. You won't have enough time in 30 minutes for you and him, or even just you alone.
No, certainly not. There'd be a million answers to that question.
But just so that anyone can go, Carrier puts this here. Mm-hmm. You don't have to say why. You can read his works.
Sure,
you can write them.
Yeah.
Tell us the Bible, New Testament, canonical text, beginning to end. You don't have to touch every single one, but where you date all the way to Revelation, and then we'll have...
So I'll preface this with, people should check my chapter 7 in On the Historicity of Jesus, where I do outline all this and my reasons and all of that. There's a methodological sub-question here, which is the main issue is that this is a vexatious problem. We don't really know the answers to a lot of these questions. None of the epistles. So epistles originally would have been dated, and we have many published editions of epistles from the ancient world outside Christianity. And dates were typical. You would have who is it addressed to and the date that it was sent. Those dates have been stripped from the epistles of Paul, which is unfortunate because we would like to have that. There's a lot of reasons why I think that happened and what's really going on with the epistles, but that's a whole different question. So it's a difficult challenge to know the answer to this question. So we can't confidently say, oh, it was definitely written then, therefore. We usually go for ranges because it was definitely written after this point and before this point. And so, and it's the antequem and the proquem, so the postquem. And so, and often those ranges are pretty big, just annoyingly big for people who want to narrow it down. So what I do methodologically is to reduce the number of arguments I have to make, I will assume the traditional consensus position on the dating of things until it matters, and then if I think the consensus is definitely wrong and it matters, then I will present my reasons for disagreeing with the consensus. And mind you, any disagreement I have with the consensus, tons of other scholars do as well. So it's not like me, the lone wolf, making these claims. There's lots of scholars that side with my dating of things too, but there is kind of like a leading consensus, like what the majority of scholars would say. I gave an example in one of the other clips we recorded, which is First Clement. Like the majority of scholars would say 95 AD. That's a weirdly specific date. There's no reason to say 95, but they put it around then, and I think that's completely wrong, and I think it's provably wrong. That's a case where I think we can't say the year it was written, but we can say it's definitely after the letters of Paul, the authentic letters of Paul, and definitely before the Jewish War, which is about a 10-year period, so we could say 60s AD for First Clement, for example. First Clement is not in most current New Testaments, however. But that's just an example of how I do think we can narrow it down, but often only to within a few years, maybe a decade. And even that's rare. Usually we're talking multiple decade ranges of possible dating. So with that caveat, what do I think with my best opinion? And like I said, these are opinions where I wouldn't necessarily use them as premises because I accept that there's a lot of uncertainty. But my assumption is that the 7 authentics, which is 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, Philemon, Philippians, Galatians, and Romans, those were authentically written by Paul. I think they're actually mismatches of multiple letters of Paul. I think there are more letters in there than are numbered in the current text. But I think they're all written by Paul, and they're all written in the 50s AD. I don't know about the order. You can argue about what order they were written in or exactly when in the 50s. I don't think that's resolvable. But you can show that the odds are they're written in the 50s AD. And I do have a blog article for people who want to see why I side with 50s AD and not 50s BC. There's a whole debate about that. There is a reason why I do, but if you want to go into that, that's my blog on how do we know Paul wrote in the 50s AD. And I'm not super confident that's the case. It's just more likely than not. He wrote in the 50s AD, and all his letters can be grouped in there. And so anything after Paul, so I think Hebrews is definitely written after, seems like it's written after Paul. Seems like it's written in the absence of Paul's authority, but by someone who's definitely a Pauline, like someone who's supporting his movement. But it was definitely written before the Jewish War. So Hebrews is 60s AD. So same as 1 Clement, I would put Hebrews in there. I suspect 1 Peter also falls into this period. It might be even earlier. It might even be earlier than the 50s. It's hard to relatively date it. I know most scholars declare 1 Peter a forgery, and they would put it in the 2nd century. And that's fine as far as it goes. Although I think it's interesting if you realize that it could be earlier, and it could be authentic. It could be actually by Peter. Because it's radically different from 2 Peter. 1 Peter is completely devoid of eyewitness testimony and all knowledge of Jesus, including the crucifixion, to Scripture. Whoever wrote 1 Peter learned all this stuff from Scripture, not from being there or whatever, right? So that's actually pretty telling, I think. When you get to 2 Peter, which is, we know for a fact was written by a different author than 1 Peter, so radically different. They're not by the same people. 2 Peter goes out of its way, flipping backwards and forwards to insist on eyewitness testimony. No, I was there. I saw this. So in a sense, it's to argue against Christians who cleverly devised myths, meaning, allegorical intertextual mythology that we've been talking about in other clips. So that's my take on that. So 2 Peter definitely is 2nd century sometime. When in the 2nd century, I have no idea. I would put it before that we have. I would put before 160 for sure. Probably assembled somewhere around 150. But you could plus minus 25 years on that, depending on which books or whatever. But this is because I side with Trobisch on the first edition. So I think there was of these books that was published together sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, vaguely saying. But that means that all of these other arts, so you have like the pastoral letters, for example, Titus and
First and Second Timothy.
2 Timothy. Those are clearly 2nd century texts. In fact, they were written very similar style to Luke Acts. So some scholars have suggested the same author wrote them both. I'm not convinced of that, but it's definitely from the same era, I think, is what's going on there. Luke Acts could be anywhere from 95, because he's relying on the Antiquities of Josephus, so it's definitely post 93. So he's writing about 95 to dates as late as 125 have been suggested. So I think it's definitely in that range. But then Matthew, Luke, and so Matthew's 80s to 90s. Mark is definitely before Matthew. Mark seems to be reacting very viscerally to the Jewish War as a recent event. Right. So I would put that in the 70s. I think Mark has some reliance on the Jewish War, so that would put it late 70s. But I'm not confident of that. They could have common sources rather than using each other. But so let's see, what does that leave? So Colossians and Ephesians, I would put post-war, but still 1st century, so late 1st century, because they seem to be uninformed of the debates in the 2nd century, but are definitely evolved thought from Paul. They share the thought of Paul, but definitely it's a Pauline sect, but it seems post-war to me. There's none of the evidence that would put like Hebrews before the war exists for Colossians and Ephesians. So it seems like this is a post-war environment, and not near post-war environment, probably later in the 1st century. Let's see, Revelation, definitely 80s or 90s, because it's building a reference to current political events through a recent history of imperial lineages. So I think whoever wrote Revelations definitely is writing in the reign of Domitian, consciously doing so, which puts you up towards 90s at the latest. And then, let's see, what have I left out? The other Gospels, I've mentioned those. I've mentioned the authentic Paulines. Epistles. The Johannines, you and I disagree on those. I think those are 2nd century. I think those are late. I think they're written around the same time and for much the same purpose as 2 Peter. That would be my opinion on that. Dennis definitely puts them earlier, I think, right? Yep. Yeah. And that's another case where they're not dated. doggone it. They would have originally had dates on them. So someone took the dates out for some reason, whatever their reasoning was.
A timeless.
I mean, yes, they want to use these for future arguments rather than the situational arguments that they're originally written for. So that would be one reason to strip the dates from them, I guess. But anyway, the dates are gone, so we don't know. So we can't rely on premises as to when they were written because we just can't prove it one way or another. And I think that's it. That's everything in the New Testament, right?
Dennis, this is fun. I love this, to hear his mind and how he thinks,
absolutely.
and then to have your mind come in. And so take us through whatever order. You don't have to start with the same ones he did. If you want to go with the Gospels and the chronology the New Testament has it in, and just tackle it that way. I'm interested in hearing your dates.
Well, I'm going to agree often with Richard's assessment, and so it's going to be more interesting to talk about places where I disagree.
Yeah, of course.
I agree that the authentic Pauline epistles probably are the earliest surviving Christian documents we have. And I would also agree that, at least in the case of 2 Corinthians, in my view, but perhaps with other Pauline literature, they are composite texts that are later put together.
Yeah, I mentioned that. I'm quite convinced of this. That
To
these
form
are
an early Pauline corpus.
Yeah.
And Trobisch is very good about identifying this four gospel collection and a Pauline collection in the mid-2nd century, so or at least by the end of the 2nd century. I hold to the Q hypothesis, and Q plus, and I would date that before the Jewish War and make it independent of, but coterminous with the Pauline letters. And so that's one place where we would disagree.
right. Good example.
I think that Mark is written in the 70s, also very concerned about the Jewish War, and is influenced by the Homeric epics as a way of treating the war. So just as the Iliad dies with the death of Hector, anticipating the fall of Troy, Mark presents Jesus as the hero who is unjustly killed prior to the fall of Jerusalem. And the reader is to take up a cross and to follow Jesus in that hardship. I think Matthew knows both the Q document and Mark, and is interested in making a hybrid gospel that, and I think the earlier clip that we had with Richard is right, that it's a way of re-Judaizing the Markan narrative and to create something for his community that has a distinctive social identity that's different.
When would you date it?
I would have to date it somewhere in the 80s, I suppose, because it's sandwiched between Mark and Papias. One place where, by the way, I think Corinthians probably is written in the 1st century still, but I would put Ephesians somewhat later.
You mean Colossians?
Colossians.
Yeah.
And
you would put Ephesians
somewhat later, around the time of Luke Acts, but I'll get to that in a moment. For me, another difference between Richard's analysis and mine is the role of Papias, and I trust with some suspicion testimony of Eusebius about Papias. Now, Papias knows the Gospel of Mark, and he knows at least two Gospels of Matthew, both of which he considers to be flawed, and he wants to write his own correction, restoring Matthew's original sequence and adding interpretation and other traditions. Now, if we can trust Papias about this, he says that Papias cites 1 Peter, which goes along with a relatively early date of 1 Peter. He refers to John the presbyter, who likely is the author of the Johannine epistles, and Eusebius says frequently he uses 1 John as a source of testimonia for his own narrative. He also has two passages that are very similar to the visions in the book of Revelation, and I think those were under Domitian, so I would place Papias's reference somewhat later, by 110, for other reasons. It's fascinating that Papias does not know the Gospel of Luke or the Acts of the Apostles or the Gospel of John. So my dating of this literature hinges very much on this understanding of
Yeah,
Papias.
I have to add that the trend in mainstream scholarship lately is to put Luke Acts closer to 115. I should mention that. Like, I can allow that it's early 90s because we don't know for sure, but it is common now to assert around a 115-ish date for Luke Acts, where that had not been the case before because that was too large a pill for most people to accept. But I think that's more plausible, and it agrees with the chronology that Dennis is talking about. So.
I think Dennis actually goes later than
About 120.
Yeah, it's not far. Yeah, correct.
Right.
We are
I
talking.
thought he said 125 before.
Honestly, plus minus 5 years is a really a high amount of accuracy.
That's exactly right. That's target. Yeah, you hit the target for that. But if that's right, and there are similarities between traditions and actual stories in Luke, Acts, and Papias, Luke has to know Papias and not the other way around, according to relative chronology. Now, the book of Revelation, though, may be also composite, because the name John appears only in the first 9 verses and in the last chapter, and actually may represent a somewhat different social situation. So I hold to those who believe, some hold that there are 7 different stages of composition in the book of Revelation, and I find that excessive and unnecessary. But then what do we do with the Gospel of John? The Gospel of John has unmistakable parallels to Luke. Now, if that's right, it's the earliest reference we have to the Gospel of Luke. And I'm suspicious that the author of the earliest version of the Gospel of John knew Luke when it was still attached to the Acts of the Apostles. And one reason for doing it is that Acts has unmistakable parallels between the Pauline section and the Bacchae of Euripides. And Jesus becomes a Dionysian character in the earliest gospel, the Gospel of John.
The earliest redaction of John, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's the earliest redaction of John, or recension.
So,
yeah. I think that would put the composition of the earliest Gospel of John after 120.
Yeah, and I think that's highly likely. I would put John between 120 and 140. Seems to be definitely the last one written. It's in argument with all the previous stuff. It very much
fix problems with it.
Correct, and it echoes ideas and thoughts bouncing around exactly around that time. So yeah, that's and I'm not alone in this. Lots of scholars are.
Yeah. And that's where I'd put Ephesians. I think Ephesians is drinking from the same well.
Yeah, and I'll say in my book I say 100 for John is the earliest, and I say I'm going to work with the assumption that it's 100 because I don't want anything to depend on it being 140. So like all my arguments depend on the earliest reasonable dates for the Gospels, even though I personally don't think that they're necessarily that early.
Yeah.
But the Gospel of John then has another layer, and this is after the expulsion of Johannine Christians from synagogues. And it assumed, before that, Johannine Christians thought they were Jews until they were excluded from the synagogues, and then they knew they weren't for other Jews. And that probably happens around the mid-20s, 120s. And you have around the same time the Bar Kokhba revolt, although somewhat later.
Dr. Samuel Zenner.
Well, then you have the what's so-called beloved disciple gospel, the epilogue to the Gospel of John, which recognizes Petrine Christianity. Although they prefer the beloved disciple, he's the one whom Jesus loved. Peter could never bring himself to say he loved Jesus. But he becomes the shepherd of the flock. And it's a recognition of multiple gospels. Many have written that if the heavens were a manuscript, they wouldn't contain.
Right, yeah.
You wouldn't have enough. But we like this gospel. But the ending of the epilogue dovetails beautifully with the beginning of 1 John. What we have seen and heard, we testified to,
right.
and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And Clement knows a text of the New Testament in which
Clement of Alexandria.
Has a text in which the gospel is followed by 1 John. And First John segues into Second and Third John. Third John ends by saying, "I have many other things to write to you," and then you have potentially a Johannine apocalypse that begins with 7 letters to the
Right.
churches. Because several people have suggested that we have in the epilogue a final redaction of the Gospel of John that initiates a Johannine corpus, which would put the corpus then around the year 130.
That would also explain how the name John gets attached to all these materials.
Exactly.
So,
And John the Elder wasn't just an elder in that he was ancient and claims to have had some contact with Jesus, but when he dies, then the notion that this generation will not pass before all these things come to pass clearly didn't work. And you have this cognitive dissonance that is causing the brothers to say, Jesus only said, "If it's my will, Mr. Peter, that he'd survive until I come."
I
What is
love
that
that
to
part.
you?
I absolutely love that part.
Isn't that wonderful?
Because I was a preterist who taught that this happened, and as a preterist, I used to say, I'd be like, why'd he say that? Because he's trying to say, I'm coming, right? Like it's about to happen, and then we're reading it. It's already happened since we read it. But now that I'm actually critical, I'm like, hold on, no. What he's saying is, listen, man, if I want to come, if it's my will, really what he's saying is, it's not my will, which is why I haven't came, so don't worry about it. And now you got 2 Peter,
yeah,
who's kind of...
it's an ass cover.
Yeah.
I would say that process of a potential Johannine corpus ends the most important stages of early Christian literature. But I think 2 Peter could be even later than that for a certain reason, or about the same time. So I think the earliest dating I would give things probably is 1 Thessalonians and 48, 49, something like that. And the latest would be the completion potentially of a Johannine corpus around 130. At least the final edition of the Gospel of John would be the terminus ad quem. And soon after that, then you get the testimony of Justin Martyr. You have the collection of the 4 gospel collection that comes in
Irenaeus.
pretty soon. You have already earlier than that by the time of Ignatius, you have a Pauline corpus that seems to have taken shape. And we have Christian apocrypha that are being written that assume the authority of some of this earlier literature. So I think around 150 is the breaking point for the construction of the New Testament, the rearrangement of these things by length, or by, we can talk about how it got rearranged and so on. Those are the dates. The one piece that I would love us to talk about in another clip is the so-called Marcion Gospel.
Yeah, because that puts a date on a lot of this stuff too, because he's supposedly using a version of Luke and the 10 epistle dossier of Paul that seems not terribly different from the one that ends up in the canon that we know.
And we have also Tatian's Diatessaron, somewhere in the late 2nd century.
Yeah.
And whatever Irenaeus and Tertullian want to say about these texts.
Yeah.
So I think our chronologies differ.
Yeah,
with
so I was the question about the
Papias and
Johannines
Corpus.
is the main deviation, but like you just gave a good argument for them being late, but you also believe they're early. So do you think that they got co-opted and attached to this corpus of Johannine literature? The letters were written late 1st century, let's say, and even though it looks like they're responding to or following on John, your position is that they got assembled that way because they could be presented in that way, not because they were originally doing it.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think Papias himself is a Johannine Christian, and he knows all the sections of the Apocalypse of John that he knows are from the vision section, not the stuff that is attributed to John. Mm-hmm. He knows 1 John, Papias knows 1 John, and that would, again, connect them to the Johannine tradition. The epistles, I think, must have circulated together, because who in the world would preserve 2 John by itself? And so I think there was a preservation of this literature. It's almost absent, except for some of the Johannine language, in the Dionysian stratum. But in the second stratum, there are some 42 near quotations of the epistles. So the people that put together the second stratum are really evoking the Johannine epistles, and they must know them as a corpus already at that stage. And then the epiloguist wants to put them together, in my view, as a corpus. Now, think of it this way. The New Testament as we have it begins with the gospel, moves to epistles, and ends with an apocalypse. And the Johannine corpus would have had the gospel, the epistles, and the apocalypse.
Just to tack what you said the other night on our way back here about Revelation, you mentioning attaching the name, that was my question to him, actually. And as we wrap this up, was simply like, okay, Revelation, who wrote this thing? He's like, we don't know. But they did attach that name to this prophet who wrote this revelation here, claiming the end's about to happen and the end under this Domitian rule, which I found fantastic, because it's like, okay, they're slapping the name on the beginning and the end here to try and go, okay, now let's circulate this as part of this canonical text. But this really has this question in my head, and we'll have to do it on another show, is like, we can talk about like what became the official here before around 150, 155. These are the books. But what did they look like before they become this is a whole nother question that I would want to know. Yeah, we can do it with John, like you talk about multiple layers. But like when we talk about Paul's epistles, are what we have what was? I mean, if Marcion has these 10 and he has this Luke that doesn't look like this, or we talked about, was it Irenaeus or one of the early Justin Martyrs? Somebody was talking about Jesus resurrecting from a cave, or being born in a cave, I'm sorry. It's like
Justin Martyr.
Yeah, so like this really makes me wonder, like, okay, hold on. Did someone finally go, guys, just like the Septuagint, we need to get together and we need to like really do something here?
Well, obviously there was a committee that did that. That was not the universal committee of the church, because there are all these competing churches that would not have been on that committee, right? So this is one group of churches, or one church that's trying to win the culture war for control of the whole church. So yeah, there was definitely a committee, I think. It could have been one guy, but I suspect it probably was a few people in one church who wanted to do this as sort of literally a propaganda mission. Like, we have to defeat and overcome these competing church movements that we don't want. We don't like them. We don't want them controlling the church. And so that's definitely something that I think happened. And here we're talking about what decisions did they make as to what books to include, what order to put them in, like what is their message by ordering the books a certain way, and what is the function of it.
I just want to put a coda on what I said. I would love to have a more detailed conversation with texts so I can demonstrate why I think the Gospel of John knows the Acts of the Apostles. You will not find that in any New Testament introduction, I'll guarantee.
Ordinarily, yeah, no.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.